In this video, we're going to look at sentences and propositions. We're going to be examining what sentences and propositions are. These are effectively the constituent parts of an argument. We're going to be looking at the distinction between what a sentence is and a proposition, okay, and how these two things are very different. And we also have to distinguish between what we call an indicative and a non-indicative sentence. This is very important when we're trying to make formal logical arguments. So when we make arguments, what we are effectively concerned with are the precise forms of reasoning. It's almost like a science, the process of argumentation. And it's for this reason that we have to, in as best sense as we possibly can, it's important that we avoid any kind of ambiguity within our arguments. So this is obviously very difficult because the English language, just like most languages, sentences are often relatively ambiguous. Take this following example. The sentence is, visiting relatives can be boring. Now, whether or not this is true or not, it depends on your particular subjective experience, but the following sentence is what we would call ambiguous, okay? But the question is why? Well, it could mean one of two things, okay? It could mean either that it can be boring to go and visit relatives, so by going and visiting relatives, that activity is boring. Or it could mean that the relatives who are visiting relatives, they are the people who are boring. So the same sentence represents two different meanings. We could be talking about two completely different things here, and they are completely different things. One involves the relatives coming over to you, and the other one involves you going to the relatives. So we would suggest that this is quite ambiguous. Okay, and this again because the sentence can refer to either of these things. Okay, we cannot tell what the inferences can be drawn from it. We cannot come to a logical conclusion about any kind of sentence like this because we don't know which of the two what kinds of things we're talking about, which of the two meanings we are referring to. So for the purpose of argumentation and logic, it's important, okay, that we have to make sure that we work with sentences that are not ambiguous, that are clearly defined as, we know the true meaning of the sentence. And we can understand unambiguous sentences as statements. So statements that are unambiguous, we would call them indicative. If we have a statement and it is unambiguous, we know the meaning, okay, just from reading the sentence, we would suggest that that is an indicative sentence or an indicative statement. So an indicative sentence is one where we can ask whether or not it's true or false. That's a very good way of trying to come to an understanding of an indicative sentence. So for example, the sentence, "It is raining outside," or the statement, "It is raining outside." You could really interchange sentence and statement. All statements are sentences, but not necessarily all sentences are statements. But this is a statement, okay? "It is raining outside." Now, for me, this particular time, this statement is false. It's not raining where I am. And we call this an indicative statement because I can assign a truth value to it without it being making sense. So what I mean by this is it can either be true or false, and to suggest that this statement is true or false is something that makes sense to us. So for example, if we say the sentence "open the window," this is an indicative sentence or a non-indicative sentence, okay? And this is why this is because you cannot assign a truth value to it. Or if you do assign a truth value to it, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to say that the sentence "open the window" is true or false. It's something different, okay? And a non-indicative sentence, when we have cases of non-indicative sentences, it doesn't make sense to say that it is true or false. Whereas it makes sense to suggest that if we say "it is raining outside," that can either be true or false. The same cannot be said for non-indicative sentences like "open the window." Now, moving on to what we are looking at here is what is a proposition. Philosophers like to use the term proposition to refer to what is being expressed when we talk about a sentence that is unambiguous. So we're talking about something that is unambiguous. It's impossible to not understand the meaning of it just from reading the sentence. Okay, unlike ambiguous sentences where you can derive more than one meaning from the sentence just by its on its face. So let's take an example. Again, it is raining. This is expressing the proposition that it is raining. That is what this sentence is doing. It's a sentence and a proposition. And this is very simply a very basic way we can describe a proposition. We can describe a proposition by ascribing what it is explaining within the sentence. However, obviously there are other philosophers such as Bertrand Russell who would go deeper when we're looking at the philosophy of propositions and the philosophy of language. However, that's a discussion for another day when we're talking about the philosophy of language. Before we finish, I want to just mention propositions in logic. So when we are looking at logic and argumentation, we're trying to identify propositions that and then trying to identify the logical relationships between these propositions. When we do this, we can write sentences that express propositions, and then what we can do is, once we've written these sentences, we can try to look at the relationship between them to try and see if we can derive any kind of valid argument. And so that's really the purpose of argumentation. So in this lesson, what we have done is looked at what a sentence is. We've looked at why some sentences are ambiguous and why some are unambiguous. And it's important that we try and remove as much ambiguity as much as we possibly can. We looked at what an indicative and a non-indicative sentence is, the kind of sentences that you can ascribe a truth value to. And then we've looked at what a proposition is when it comes to argumentation. And so now we've basically built up the foundations of argumentation. What we're going to do in the next lesson is start to build our arguments.